My research is on public perceptions of cultivated meat. What do consumers think of it? Are people going to buy it? I'm also aware that I'm one of the last things standing between you all and going for a beer right now, so I'll try to be brief. Okay, so here we can see a bunch of different survey data, which roughly is asking a bunch of people, would you eat cultivated meat? You can see the proportion in green who say that they would, the proportion in red who say that they wouldn't, and in yellow, the undecideds. So what you'll notice is there's a massive difference between the different surveys. And what that tells us is we can really affect consumer perceptions and consumer willingness to eat cultured meat by the way that we talk about it. Each of these different surveys will have described cultivated meat in a different way, used different names, for example. You can see that at the lowest, 16% of people said that they would eat it. And at the highest, that's up at 2/3 of people. So the difference is huge. There's some pretty consistent demographic trends in who says that they will eat it. Here you have a bunch of different studies along the bottom, but the important thing is the consistency of the difference between the different color bars here. You can see, in almost all cases, more men say that they'd be willing to eat cultivated meat compared to women. Now, this is kind of flipped from the trend that we see in vegetarianism and veganism, and that should be a good thing for us. We can have this thing that is primarily appealing to male consumers who are far less likely to be cutting out their meat consumption altogether. Men also eat about 50% more meat than women overall, and so this appeal to men is a pretty good thing on that sense. Here again, we can see the differences in age groups. Now, cultivated meat is something that's primarily more appealing to younger consumers. Pretty much younger people are more open to new things in general. Older consumers are more likely to stick with what they're used to and less likely to adopt new products of this type. There's some evidence as well that this is a product that's more appealing to people who are a little bit more left-leaning in their political views. So liberals more so than conservatives find these products appealing. Interesting to note, it's likely that that's because basically these people are already aware of the problems of animal agriculture, and it's aligned a bit more with some of their values, trying to avoid animal products. This is an important one. This is often seen as something that is a way for vegetarians to be able to eat meat again. Now, that is my own motivation for doing this. I've been vegetarian for a number of years, and I really miss eating meat, so I'm looking forward to getting back to it when we have some cultivated meat. So you guys need to hurry up and bring it. This is actually a product that's primarily appealing to omnivores. So the majority of vegetarians are not really interested in eating cultivated meat. This is something that's for meat eaters. Now again, of course, this is a good thing. The benefits of cultivated meat, as we all know, are coming from its ability to displace demand for conventional meat. If this comes to be seen as a product that's mainly for vegetarians, that's going to be a bad thing for the market. And this is an important one as well. The more familiar people are with cultivated meat, the more likely they are to say they'd eat it. So this is in a bunch of survey data, and you can also see this borne out in focus groups. At the start of focus groups discussions, people are often a bit wary of the new technology. Once they think about it for a while, consider some of the benefits, they become much more positive to it overall. This is something that will be an important trend in the future, because at the moment, we're still at a stage where most people haven't heard of cultivated meat. So whatever survey numbers we see at the moment, that reflects that the majority of people are hearing about this for the first time. So a good number of those people who are saying that they wouldn't eat it, perhaps they would if they're exposed to it for a little longer. Now this is some original data, never before seen, I believe, that has been done by Rosalim Jemy in Poland in particular. Now, here we actually saw 50% of people saying that they would eat cultivated meat. You had only 22% of people saying that they wouldn't eat it, and 28% undecided. Looking at the demographic breakdown, you see all of the same trends that we see more generally. Higher acceptance amongst men, higher acceptance amongst younger people, and urban and more educated consumers as well. These are also fairly strong trends that weren't mentioned on the previous slides, but urban consumers much more open to cultivated meat than rural consumers in general. So there are a number of benefits that people understand when they think about cultivated meat. And the most obvious one is that you don't have to kill animals. So this is kind of obvious to people by the nature of it. It's animal-free meat. People get straight away that that's part of the benefit. Whether that's something that will really motivate people is a different issue. A second thing is better for the environment. Now, this is something that more and more people are becoming aware of with regards to meat consumption. More people know that meat is basically bad for the environment, but again, far fewer are actually willing to give it up on that basis. Another thing people think about cultivated meat is that this could help to feed the world. Perhaps this will be able to produce meat more cheaply and bring meat to people who can't afford it at the moment. They're right, but not quite in the way that it's often construed. Realistically, cultivated meat is likely to be much more expensive than conventional meat when it first comes to market. But like all technology, it gets better and it gets cheaper the longer it exists, basically, and the more work is done on it. And last, this is something that almost nobody says, it could increase food safety. So this is actually something that a real minority of consumers clock as a benefit, but some people do recognize that, and particularly in relation to foodborne diseases. So, for example, swine flu, bird flu, BSE, which was in the UK a number of years ago. Basically, using animals for food means that you're prone to all of these diseases and problems coming in. And this is something which we can get around with cultivated meat. So here we can see the results of an experiment in which people saw either ethical, environmental, or health arguments in favor of cultivated meat. You can see here that the people who saw environmental and health arguments became more likely to say that they would eat cultivated meat, in particular the health arguments. And the people who saw the ethical arguments actually became slightly less likely to say they would eat cultivated meat. So we don't have a lot of data on this point, but we're starting to look at what are the most relevant messages to give to consumers to get them behind this new technology. So we also see a number of barriers to acceptance, and these are going to be important to address. First is that people know it will cost too much. Now, a lot of this comes from some of the early headlines that you might have seen around the $300,000 hamburger. Some people who have heard of cultivated meat have often read those articles, many comment, I wouldn't pay that for a hamburger, which obviously nobody is expecting them to. A lot of people have the intuition that it won't taste the same, or that the texture won't be as good, that it will be somehow an inferior meat to meat from animals. So that's something to address as well. The main one is that people think that it could be unsafe. This is something that comes in when people are thinking about biotechnology, in particular in their food. People have the intuition that there's an unpredictable element of it and that it could introduce some kind of food safety issues. And closely related to that is the perception of unnaturalness. People think it's unnatural, therefore it must be bad. Of course, that's something that doesn't really hold up. If you think about it, there are many unnatural things that we do which are very beneficial, like taking paracetamol, and also many natural things which are very bad, like hurricanes. So here we can see some survey data from the UK, and these are the concerns that people expressed. You can see that all of the most common concerns here are all around food safety and or naturalness, which, as I say, is closely related. So people saying they're worried about what chemicals or ingredients it contains. They're worried about possible long-term side effects. And then down here, a substantially smaller proportion of people mentioning the taste, look and the smell, and the expense. So really the major issue to address is the perception that cultivated meat could be unsafe. So I'll talk a little bit about nomenclature, which Elliot mentioned earlier on. This has kind of gone through several stages. First, when it was only the scientists talking about this, they were using the term in vitro meat. After that, we kind of innovated, and somebody said if we call it cultured meat, that probably sounds a bit more like something that people can relate to. From there, the Good Food Institute started pushing the term clean meat, which performed very well in consumer tests and was shown to be more appealing to consumers than cultured meat and other names. But one problem with that was that as the industry started to take shape, and especially to have interest from conventional meat processors, some of the stakeholders want names which are not going to isolate stakeholders which it might be important to get on our side. The thinking here is that you don't really want a situation where it's the cultivated meat industry versus the conventional meat industry, but rather in recent years you've actually seen the conventional meat industry getting substantial buy-in to cultivated meat. And for that reason, many of those stakeholders were unhappy with the term clean meat. There's also some research that suggests that it's actually better in the long term to be using terminology which is seen as more transparent, not seen as marketing terms. So I think that was always another issue with the name clean meat. From there, about a year ago, they moved towards the term cell-based meat, which I never liked personally. I mean, it didn't perform quite as well with consumers, and also it's a little bit redundant because all meat is cell-based in a way, as the previous speaker explained. And so the latest thinking and terminology is cultivated meat. This is something that meets all of the criteria that I've mentioned. It doesn't isolate stakeholders that we need to keep on side, is fairly appealing to consumers, is quite transparent what we're talking about, and it doesn't seem like a marketing term. It performs quite well with consumers, but it doesn't seem like it's a marketing term. And down here, as Elliot mentioned, we have a bunch of derogatory names which we would prefer to keep out of media stories, including lab-grown meat and artificial meat and so on. This is the results of an experiment where we were speaking about cultivated meat in a number of different frames. So one here, we were focusing on the societal benefits, saying that it was a way to reduce harm to animals and help the environment. This was our high-tech framing, in which we said that it was made using highly advanced technology and the state-of-the-art lab. And this one here, which has gone a little off the screen, basically focused on the similarities to conventional meat. So it's very similar to the meat that you're already used to, basically. And if we look at the results of this is on a 5-point scale of how willing to eat it people were. You can see, first of all, that the overall results were pretty good. This number 3 is the midway point. But that the high-tech framing actually substantially reduced the willingness to eat it. And this is something that's reflected in, some of the negative data around the name cell-based meat and some of the media framings that you see. That meat in the Petri dish is quite typical of something that's used fairly broadly in the media. And here we showed that when it's framed in such a way and such imagery is used, it actually reduces the consumer appeal. Here this is making a similar point, basically. This is comparing a technical description with a non-technical description. And you can see that the less technical description performs better on a number of consumer measures as well. This is looking at some data comparing a bunch of different countries. Now, this one in particular, I would encourage you not to put too much stock in, not least because it's about 15 years old at this point. But this is one of the only comparisons that we have of a bunch of different countries in Europe. So this is just from last year. In the previous graph, the UK was somewhere in the middle to the top in terms of acceptance within Europe. And last year, this data demonstrated that acceptance in the US is substantially higher than acceptance in the UK, which probably means higher than acceptance in most of Europe. So perhaps it's fortunate that products there will likely be first. You'll also find a much more receptive consumer base. This was a study which we did last year, comparing acceptance in the US to China and India. This was previously countries that very little research had looked at, but are increasingly important given how these are the consumers coming online and buy, will be a substantial amount of the global demand for meat in the future. And kind of to our surprise, our pleasant surprise, you might say, we found way higher acceptance in India and China compared to the USA. So again, the previous speaker mentioned the Asian markets. This was some really good data to suggest that those are going to be some very promising markets to hit. Within Asia here, this is YouGov data from last year. We saw particularly high acceptance in Vietnam. And China, which was our reference point from the previous study, was actually towards the bottom of this list. So we're finding kind of higher acceptance still in other parts of Asia. In particular, Singapore is one to watch, as the previous speaker mentioned. This is a technology that the government of Singapore is very interested in from a food security perspective. Now, some data from Europe. This is all compared to the UK, which is the reference point of one. This is the funny way which data is expressed in academic papers sometimes. But basically, we see slightly higher acceptance in the Netherlands and Finland, and lower acceptance in Spain, and lowest of all in Poland. So all the perhaps we could interpret this positively, that the optimistic data we saw from Poland earlier, we can expect even higher in the rest of Europe. But I've been told that this is an unsurprising pattern because Netherlands and Finland are in this group of countries which are traditionally considered like quite pragmatic, basically. And for those reasons, it's unsurprising to see higher acceptance there. And I think the next slide is the last one on the different countries. Yeah, here we saw actually higher acceptance in Spain than in the UK, which is entirely contradictory to the previous slide, and lower in Brazil and the Dominican Republic. Just quickly whip through some of the projects in this area that we have ongoing. We're looking at the appeal of specific cultivated meat products, so different species of products and also different types of products. Tracking consumer attitudes over time is something that's going to start happening now. We hopefully will see increasing acceptance over time. As I mentioned earlier, people becoming more familiar with the technology is likely to be a driver of that. We're also going to be looking into whether there is a different consumer appeal in different purchase settings. We might imagine that in restaurants, consumers are a bit more trusting of food that they're ordering compared to food that they're buying in a supermarket and cooking themselves. Thank you.